Hi, welcome to my talk, Using Cats to Perfect Your Software Architecture. So my name's Andy Clarke, Magic Weasel on Twitter. I co-run a user group in Shropshire, in Telford, called Shropshire Devs. So if you're ever in the West Midlands, please look us up. And I work for Proto Labs in the week. We do 3D printing and traditional manufacturing techniques to help companies prototype products. But I'm here to talk to you about cats. So what is this nonsense? Well, the thing is that cats are quite easy to reason about. We know what the boundaries of a cat look like. But when we're at work, some of these kind of things we're inventing, these mental models of our problems that we're facing at work, are not that easy to reason about. Like, it's difficult to see where the boundaries are. So this nonsense is about maybe if we look at some of the problems with cats, we can more easily see where they've gone wrong. So I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. There's a new tablet game on the market, Virtual Pets. It's the new Fortnite. All the kids are playing it, but they've only got dogs available, and they want to introduce cats. And you're delighted to find that they're in your local area and after a back-end developer. So you get the job, and it's day one. So they show you their MVP product, but it's pretty rudimentary. That's all it does. And then you get shown through the architecture. We've got an API here where you pass in an ID for the cat, and you get a little bit of JSON back with noise and a hunger level for the cat. And then the existing architectures, as you might expect, we've got a web API doing the request and the response, a domain with a business logic, and a data access layer at the back end. And in the domain, it looks as you might expect. So day two, you get your first task, and it's create an API to feed the cat. So you go into the web API and add a kind of suffix for feed at the end of it. And then we go into our class objects, and we just bang in a feed method. And we have a look through the existing code in the solution, and we find a food repository there. So we just use the food repository and grab the food to feed the cat. There's only dog food there, but you figure it's brown and meaty and will probably do for an MVP. So give it a test, and we're returning back a purr now, and we've lowered the cat's hunger level, so all good. And you put it over to code review and go home. Day two, did well. But you come in on day three, and there's a notification and some comments on your PR from the team, and they're feeling that it's overly coupled, plus you haven't actually got the food into the cat's stomach, which you weren't even aware about. And so you've been asked to decouple some of this code. So kind of what went wrong here? And one of the things where we've gone wrong is that we've taken a dependency straight on that food repository. So we've coupled cat very much to that food repository. And as we know, we coupled it to the dog food. There's no other way of feeding the cat anything else. And it's got to come from that food repository, and it's all quite coupled. And so coupling is the measure of how dependent one program module is on another. And there's another side to the coin as well. So if we keep adding use cases, so we added the food repository to cat, and if we needed to brush the cat and then put a dependency within cat to the brush, and then various transport mechanisms for the cat, and keep coupling those to cat, it's going to become harder to manipulate cat because it's tied to all these other things. And then this guy in the 1960s came up with the idea, the metrics of coupling and cohesion. And the other side is the cohesion, because he said that you don't want to kind of, you want to tell a cohesive story about the problem you're trying to solve. And with today's frameworks, it's like very easy with dependency injection to get these slithers of functionality, and kind of they're built at runtime, but you're not actually telling a story anywhere about the problem you're trying to solve. So we want to avoid high coupling, but we also want to avoid low cohesion and kind of aim for this sweet spot in the middle where we've got low coupling and high cohesion. So Robert Martin in Clean Architecture in 2017, it builds on some of his earlier kind of clean code. But he had this architecture diagram where he's got kind of use cases and entities, and they're labeled up as enterprise business rules and application business rules. So what are the difference between these two? So I'm going to take a quick diversion from cats to coffee. Imagine you're working for a coffee manufacturer, And then you've got this kind of coffee machine they want to bring to market for home use with a little timer to kind of get your coffee fresh for the morning when you wake up. Well, the enterprise business rules for making coffee are, it helps to think about what that process would be if you were manually doing that task. So if you had one of those stovetop espresso makers, you've got a water source going in, you've got some ground coffee, you're going to have a brew process, and then you're going to collect that coffee in a coffee receptacle. And that's what you'd do if you had a kind of stovetop espresso maker. But it's also the essence of making coffee in most coffee machines. So if you've got this one with the timer, that timer's application business logic. The essence of coffee never changes, like that brew process. And the same if you've got this kind of aimed at maybe a conference. There's larger water sources, larger coffee receptacles, but the essence of making coffee never changes. And the same with a vending machine. You've got additional problems like taking payment, but the essence of coffee, making coffee stays the same. And bean to cup or Apple Pay on the vending machine are application business logic around that central enterprise business rules. So we'll take these things into day 4, and we'll strip back Cat to his essence. And we're also going to kind of slot in a new place with use cases. So we can kind of, when we feed the cat, we're going to do it in use cases, and we're going to leave kind of the essence of cat alone in domain. So here's the feed the cat use case that we're putting in use cases. So the other thing he was saying was that we hadn't managed to get that food into the cat's stomach. So we go have a look for the stomach table, and we find that in the database, and it looks pretty self-explanatory. So we have a look around, and there's no stomach repository. So we quickly build one to grab the stomach out and so we can save it. And then in the feed the cat use case, we're now taking the food type, and then we grab the stomach from the repo, and then we add the food. And put that back into code review and go home for the day. Next day, more problems, more comments on your PR. What about the internals of cat like digestion? Please refactor to respect the boundaries of cat. Because it turns out when we've grabbed that stomach, that's an internal thing that's kind of private to that cat. It doesn't want you to be taking its stomach out and feeding it directly. And it turns out like cats are very complex organisms. I can show you some of their internals today. And then, so the digestion property of that stomach really kind of we don't want every person who puts food into that cat's stomach to then have to manage that cat's digestion. That's some complexity we want to abstract from consumers of this class. It's just, you just feed the cat, and then we can digest the food. Like, you don't even have to worry about it. And then if we want to make the cat more complex, we can take these other aspects of the cat we want to represent and put them all internally. And Eric Evans, in his domain-driven design, had talked about something that could be helpful here. And he had the concept of aggregates, where you have like a collection of domain objects that you treat as a single unit. So when you take them from a repository, you take them with these internal domain objects, and when you save them with the internals. You don't actually kind of dip lower in the abstraction to kind of take pieces out. And so when we're grabbing from the repository, we're going to take the cat with its stomach, and the same when we persist. So here's kind of cat in domain, where we've just got a private stomach, and then when we feed the cat the food, we're going to call the digestion ourselves, and we're not going to make that a responsibility of people external to cat. Okay, so now things are looking better. We're like grabbing the food, we're grabbing the cat from the cat repo when we're feeding the cat. So we put it over. Finally, we've got through code review and we're into test. And day 6, we've got a notification from the tester. It turns out we've been caught out. It's not just brown and meaty. There are other differences. And so we should give a bad request if the cat is fed dog food. So we just go into cat in domain. If the food type equals dog, then throw a bad request exception. So that's going to kind of hit the MVC framework, and we're going to give our bad request. So you give it a test, bad request, all looks good, and then back into code review. Next day, more comments on the PR. Please don't couple domain objects to the MVC framework, uncouple from the MVC framework. Because what's happened here is when we did that bad request exception, we've actually kind of brought in elements of MVC and the web itself. Like, the cat really doesn't have any business knowing about the web or MVC, and it's looking decidedly unhealthy. And it kind of, Robert Martin in Clean Architecture as well, he talks about the web being an implementation detail and the database being an implementation detail. And he's looking for you to solve that problem in those central two rings. And then it doesn't matter what kind of framework or kind of database, if you're using Mongo or if you're using MVC or Android, you're solving the domain problem, and then these implementation details go around the outside. So a way to solve this is we can throw a cat digestion exception, just something specific, and then we can handle that in the web API layer, look for that cat digestion exception, and then throw our implementation-specific bad request. So we're finally there. And I just wanted to talk briefly about, in summary, that this guy, he came up with Coupling and Cohesion in the 60s, and he published this in 1974 with some of his other colleagues. And I think everyone here has heard of Coupling and Cohesion, but he had another thing to talk about, and that was the Point of Highest Abstraction. And I don't think that's really something that's kind of filtered down through the ages. We've heard of Coupling and Cohesion, but not the Point of Highest Abstraction. And what he was saying you should look for is the most abstract form of your input data, and then what are the central important transformations you want to make, and then what's the most abstract output data. And if you think about that kind of in today's world, that might be the web request coming in, and then the database, you take that web request, you load up some things from the database, and then you've got your abstract data, and what transforms do you want to do on that? So if you think about, we're grabbing the cat repo, we're grabbing the food, and then the central transform is the cat eats the food, the cat becomes larger. And so when we solved the problem database first, we ended up in some problems. And the same when we came about the problem web first, when we thought about the problem web first. But when we came at it from the point of highest abstraction, then things came good for us. So I think it's very similar to what Robert Martin has to say about kind of implementation details of the web and the database. So kind of look for those kind of central pieces of your enterprise logic that don't change with the applications you're producing, and kind of respect the internals and kind of put up boundaries of the things you don't want the consumers of your enterprise business logic to have to worry about. And then the use cases can go around the outside, brushing the cat, feeding the cat. And then finally, the implementation details. So you've got MVC with the SQL Server database. But then if you're using Android, you don't have to necessarily worry. And the same with Mongo or even WinForms if you're so inclined. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you.